If you find VAT a bit daunting and confusing, don't worry, you're not alone. There's a lot to take in and it differs from country to country. But the reality is that you could be leaving money on the table. And not dealing with VAT correctly could also land you in trouble with the taxman, and we don't want that. The good news is that I've decoded the complex world of UK VAT legislation so you don't have to. And this video is packed with the clarity you've hopefully been looking for around UK VAT. We'll cover why you need to care about VAT as a UK Etsy seller, when and how you need to start collecting VAT on Etsy, and what this means for your Etsy business and profits. If we've not met before, I'm Daniel and I'm an Etsy seller based in the UK. I also have a master's degree in international business and years of experience working in the business world in consulting and tech. Before we do dive in, just a caveat that I am not a financial expert and that the information in this video is not supposed to be personal financial advice. So please be sure to speak with a tax professional about what would work best for you in terms of VAT. So first things first, what is VAT? It's essentially a sales tax that's added to most things we buy or sell. A lot of countries use the VAT system, but a lot also don't. And for those that do use it, the VAT rate usually varies country by country. In Europe, it usually falls between 19 and 27%, and in the UK, VAT is typically 20%. Okay, so how does VAT impact our Etsy shops? Well, whether you need to take VAT into account for your Etsy sales depends on a couple of different important things. Firstly, if you're registered VAT, and also where your customers are. Let's first talk about VAT registration, what that actually means, and if you need to be VAT registered. Being VAT registered basically means that you've told the government, hey, I'm selling stuff and I'm doing well, I'm a real business. And by doing this, you're agreeing to handle VAT in a certain way. It also means that you're creating a so-called business-to-business relationship with any companies or suppliers you work with. So for example, with Etsy and any other supply companies you may use. So do I need to be VAT registered? In the UK, there is an £85,000 threshold in a rolling 12-month period. This means that if you make or are expecting to make more than £85,000 in revenue in a rolling 12-month period, you need to register for VAT. If you're not making that much in revenue yet, then you don't need to register. Now, you can choose to register voluntarily even if you're below that threshold. There may be different reasons why you may want to personally do that. I'll touch upon that in a little bit. But let's first look at a couple of different scenarios to better understand this. Let's first have a look what happens when you're not VAT registered. Well, things are pretty simple. Because you're not registered, you're not expected to pay VAT on any of your Etsy sales. But you do need to pay VAT on anything you buy for your business or any other expenses you may incur. This is because in this case, the law basically sees you as a regular buyer or consumer rather than a business. So this means that you need to pay VAT on the Etsy fees you pay, money spent on any ongoing business needs like software you use to design your products or tools to make them. And yes, this also means you pay VAT on the materials you buy to make your products. So for example, if you buy wool to make cozy handmade mittens, then you will typically pay VAT on purchasing that wool. And for those of you doing print on demand, the providers such as Printify or Printful will typically also charge you VAT on the cost. But when it comes to print on demand, it's a little bit more complicated and intricate. I'm actually going to dedicate an entire other video to talk specifically around print on demand and VAT. So let's look at an example for this, and we're going to assume that I'm selling a t-shirt for £25. So over here on the left in revenue, we can see that I received £25 and no VAT is charged on that. I'm charging £5 in shipping, again, no VAT. I do, however, pay VAT on my expenses and costs. So let's say that t-shirt costs me £10 to make. I will be charged £2 extra on that for VAT. Similarly, I'll pay VAT on shipping, so an additional £1 on top of that £5. And then I'll also pay VAT on my Etsy fees. Now let's look at what happens when you are VAT registered. It's a big step up and basically means that the government now sees you as a real business. And yep, this then also changes things in how you operate. It means you're in a business-to-business relationship with any companies you work with, such as Etsy and any other suppliers. This is really important because it changes how you deal with taxes and VAT. Instead of being treated like an individual shopper or consumer, you're now being treated as a business, which means you can reclaim VAT on any of your business expenses, but it also means that you now need to start collecting and remitting VAT on your sales. You'll be expected to submit your VAT number to Etsy so that they know how to handle your finances. Okay, but what does that mean for me? Well, the biggest change is your new role in collecting VAT. When you sell an item via Etsy to someone in the UK, you're now in charge of collecting and remitting VAT on each one of those sales. This means that when someone buys your product, part of what they pay is VAT, which you don't get to keep. You're essentially collecting this money on behalf of the government. And when you're VAT registered, this is not optional, this is a must. Etsy sadly also won't do this VAT stuff for you if you're based in the UK and selling to the UK. When you sell something, Etsy gives you all of the money that you charged for it, including the VAT part. It's your job to keep track of those VAT amounts and then remit them to HMRC. This means that you need to get really good at understanding how much money you're actually making and how much of that is VAT. And when it comes to reporting to HMRC, there's also more paperwork involved. You'll typically have to submit quarterly VAT returns along with some other documentation at times. Sounds depressing, right? Well, the good news is that there is a bit of a silver lining to this. Unlike if you're not VAT registered, when you are registered, you don't need to pay VAT on business expenses anymore. So you know how you get charged VAT on your Etsy fees? Well, if you're VAT registered, you won't have to do that anymore. The same goes for most other expenses that you may have. So any material costs you have, software subscriptions, you name it. So as you can see from this example here, when you're VAT registered, you are expected to collect and remit VAT on the revenue or the sale of an item that you make on Etsy. So for example, if I'm selling that t-shirt from earlier for £25, I will be expected to pay £5 of that in VAT to the government. Similarly, in shipping, if I'm charging £5, £1 of that is going to the government. However, when it comes to expenses, because we now have this business-to-business relationship, you don't get charged VAT on any costs you have. So obviously we're interested in seeing how this is now going to compare in terms of the impact that it has on our profit. Let's have a look at a profit comparison right now. Before we do that, if you feel like you're learning something, please feel free to hit the thumbs up below. And if you'd like to learn more Etsy business strategies going forward, feel free to subscribe. I post weekly videos. So if we now compare our revenue and our expenses from if we were not VAT registered versus we were registered, we can see the cost breakdown here, right? We can see that when we're not VAT registered, overall, we're going to be making more revenue because we don't have to remit any revenue to HMRC. However, we're paying more in expenses because we need to pay VAT on all of our expenses. On the other hand, if you're VAT registered, you receive less revenue because you need to remit some of that to the government, but then your expenses are less because you're not expected to pay VAT on those. Overall, as you can see, if you're not VAT registered, for this scenario specifically, you're coming out with a little bit higher of a profit if you're not VAT registered. This is again assuming a sale from the UK to someone else in the UK. Now, a question I get asked often is, okay, I understand the profit difference here. How do I now account for this in my pricing? Well, it's a really interesting topic and there's quite a lot to it. I'm actually going to be posting a separate video all around VAT pricing in the future, but in a very small, short nutshell, I think there's 3 different ways to approach pricing when it comes to VAT registration. You can either leave your price as is, and that way you're essentially absorbing the VAT cost yourself and reducing the profit that you're making. You could also raise your prices to essentially balance out that profit loss that you get from registering VAT. Or, and this is my personal recommendation, finding a little bit of a middle point, a bit of a hybrid, where you're essentially absorbing a little bit of the additional costs, but also not letting it affect your profits as much. But one of the biggest takeaways that you need to consider from this is that this is just an example of a scenario, right? The way that you operate, the way that you price your products, the customers that you sell to may be completely different to what I've mapped out here. So this is a really personal, unique situation that you need to look at and analyze for yourself. But I do hope that this was at least a little bit helpful to get a little bit of a comparison. But there's something else really important that I need to tell you about. Everything we've talked about so far mostly applies if you're based in the UK and selling to someone else in the UK. VAT starts to get a bit trickier when you're selling to people in other countries. VAT is usually charged based on the location of your customer, not where you're based. This means that VAT may still be applicable if you're selling to someone outside of the UK, regardless of if you're VAT registered or not in the UK. So for example, let's say you're based in the UK but selling to someone in Germany. Regardless of if you're VAT registered or not in the UK, your customer will be expected to pay VAT at the German rate, so 19%. Now the good news is that when it is an international sale like this, Etsy will help you out. During checkout, Etsy automatically figures out how much VAT to add based on where your buyer lives and what you're selling. And even better, in this case, Etsy also takes care of remitting that VAT to the appropriate government so that you don't have to worry about it. This means you don't need to go away and start adjusting your prices, you just sell your stuff and Etsy handles the rest. But what if you sell something to a place that doesn't do VAT, like the US for example? Well, those buyers don't have to pay VAT at all. They may, however, have to pay a sales tax, but in these cases, Etsy also takes care of that for you, so it's not something you really need to worry about. So there's obviously a lot to consider when it comes to VAT. There's lots of different factors, and this makes everyone's circumstances unique. What works for one person might not work for another. So this is why I urge you to go away and speak with a tax professional to really get personalized VAT advice. I'm personally based in the UK, but I actually use Etsy to sell to customers all around the world. To learn more about how I do this, go and check out this video next.